Welcome to 10700, your research-informed guide to navigating the second half of life. In 10700, we explore the ideas, evidence, and habits that help men understand how their health, relationships, and inner lives evolve after midlife. Today's article, The Mobility Shift You Didn't Notice. Mobility rarely changes in a way that announces itself. For most men, it shifts quietly, through moments that still feel familiar, but not quite the same. A staircase asks for a little more effort. Uneven ground requires a bit more attention. Getting up from the floor, stepping off a curb in wet weather, or catching yourself when your footing isn't quite right all remain possible, yet they no longer feel entirely automatic. What makes these changes easy to dismiss is their subtlety. In midlife, most men are still functioning well enough that they don't think of themselves as having a mobility problem at all. They simply assume that movement feels different because they're getting older. That assumption contains a grain of truth, but it also hides something more important. Mobility isn't a single ability that disappears late in life. It's a multi-system capacity that begins shifting earlier and more gradually than most people realize. And because those changes happen beneath the surface, they're often misunderstood until they become harder to ignore. What mobility actually is. When most men hear the word mobility, they think about flexibility. They think about stiffness, tight hips, or whether a joint moves freely without discomfort. That's understandable, because flexibility is easy to feel. A tight muscle gets your attention in a way that declining balance or slower reaction time does not. But mobility, in the fuller sense, is something much broader. It's the integrated ability to move confidently and efficiently through the world. It depends on strength, because the body has to generate force. It depends on power, because that force often has to be produced quickly. It depends on balance and coordination, because the body is never perfectly still. It depends on sensory systems, because vision, proprioception, and the vestibular system are constantly informing the brain about position and movement. And it depends on attention, because real life doesn't happen in controlled conditions. Once mobility is understood that way, it stops looking like a narrow fitness concept and starts to look more like what it really is. A whole-body expression of how well multiple systems are working together. And that changes the timing of the story, because when mobility is multi-system, it doesn't suddenly fail. It gradually loses margin. When mobility begins to change. One of the most limiting assumptions men carry is that mobility decline belongs to old age, as though the body moves along unchanged through the 40s and 50s, and then suddenly begins to break down later. That's not how the evidence reads, and it's not how the body behaves. Muscle mass begins to decline around the fourth decade of life. Strength becomes more difficult to maintain. Some of the cognitive processes that support balance and coordinated movement, like processing speed and attention, also begin to shift. But these changes don't announce themselves. The body compensates. A man can still work, travel, play golf, and stay active, while gradually losing some of the reserve that once made movement feel effortless. He might avoid getting down on the floor because getting back up feels less appealing. He might choose flatter routes without thinking about it. He might move more cautiously in the dark or on ice. None of these changes is dramatic on its own. That's exactly why they're easy to miss. And that's why the myths that follow matter so much, because they shape how men interpret these signals. Myth 1. Physical decline after 50 is inevitable. This myth rarely gets stated outright, but it quietly shapes behavior. Men notice that things feel different, and they begin to assume that decline is simply part of the script. There's only so much you can do after 50. The body is heading in one direction. What makes this belief so limiting is that it turns change into resignation. The research supports something more nuanced. Yes, biological systems change with age, but change is not the same as inevitability, and decline can be reversed. Even in older adults with existing limitations, structured physical activity has been shown to improve mobility. Not just fitness, but the ability to move through the world independently. That matters. It shows that the system remains responsive. The more accurate interpretation is not that decline is inevitable, but that the trajectory is still partly negotiable. Myth 2. You cannot build muscle after 50. This myth feels believable because the body does change. Recovery takes longer. Gains may come more slowly. The body doesn't respond the way it once did. From there, it's an easy step to assume that muscle can only be lost, not rebuilt. But the evidence doesn't support that conclusion. Even very old adults remain capable of significant strength gains when resistance training is applied properly. That matters because muscle is one of the central engines of mobility. It allows a man to rise, climb, carry, and recover. The more accurate interpretation is not that the body can't adapt after 50. It's that it requires a stronger and more consistent signal than many men are giving it. Myth 3. Joint pain means you should move less. Pain feels like a warning, and sometimes it is, which makes it easy to assume that discomfort means the body needs protection and rest. But pain and damage are not always the same thing. In many common conditions after 50, movement remains part of the solution. What matters is not whether a man moves, but how he moves, how much he moves, and how the surrounding systems support the affected area. When men respond to pain by moving less, they often reduce strength, coordination, and confidence at the same time. The system becomes less capable, even while the original issue remains. The more useful frame is not that pain means stop. It's that pain often calls for intelligent modification rather than withdrawal. Myth 4. Balance problems are just part of aging. Balance is easy to ignore when it's working. It hides inside ordinary movement. So, when it begins to change, it's often interpreted as one of those unavoidable parts of aging. But balance is not a single trait. It's a trainable capacity built from multiple systems: strength, coordination, sensory input, and attention. Research shows that balance-focused exercise can meaningfully reduce falls, which tells us the system is responding to input. What's often overlooked is that balance becomes more cognitive with age. It depends more on attention. That's why men may feel steady when focused, and less steady when distracted, rushed, or carrying something. Balance isn't a fading gift. It's a system that can still be strengthened. Myth 5. Walking is all the exercise you need. Walking is one of the most valuable habits a man can maintain. It's accessible, sustainable, and supports cardiovascular health. But it's not a complete solution. Mobility depends on capacities that walking alone doesn't challenge enough: strength, power, and balance under changing conditions. Walking provides a strong foundation, but after 50, it works best as part of a broader portfolio. Myth 6. If you were not active earlier, it is too late. This myth carries a particular weight. Men look back and compare themselves to earlier versions of their bodies, and it's easy to assume the opportunity has passed. But the evidence points in a different direction. Even in very old adults, training can produce meaningful improvements in strength, muscle, and functional movement. The body doesn't require a perfect history to remain adaptable. It requires a signal. The more useful question is not what could have been done earlier, it's what can still be done now. And the answer is more than most men expect. Mobility is a systems story. By now, a different picture should be coming into focus. Mobility is not about one joint, one exercise, or one habit. It's a systems story. Strength, balance, power, sensory input, coordination, and attention all contribute. And what a man experiences in daily life is the combined result of those systems working together. That's why mobility can be so easy to misread. The body is often managing several small shifts at once, and those shifts can stay hidden until something unexpected reveals how much margin has been lost. A more useful frame is that mobility after 50 is shaped by the ongoing relationship between changing biology and the signals a man continues to give the system. Mobility is something you steward. One of the quietest shifts in midlife is that movement stops being something you can take for granted and starts becoming something you have to stay in relationship with. That's not a failure. It's part of living in a body that adapts. The mistake is not aging. It's assuming that every change means the same thing, or that early signs of difficulty are proof that decline is already fixed. In reality, mobility is neither fixed nor accidental. It's shaped by how consistently strength, balance, coordination, and attention are maintained across time, which means many of the changes men notice are better understood as signals, not sentences. And that shift, from interpretation to awareness, from resignation to response, is where the real opportunity lives. Because the ability to move through the world with steadiness, confidence, and enough reserve to keep saying yes to ordinary life is not something that disappears all at once. It's something that can still be shaped. You've been watching 10700, your research-informed guide to navigating the second half of life. If you would like to read the full article or explore the science behind what you've just watched, visit the 10700 website. The second half of life gives you about 10,700 days. What are you going to do with yours?